I just want to say, I'm delighted and honored to host Mr. Elliott Abrams again here in Houston. I always think it's one thing the government needs to work out. An ambassador is a clear title, a general is a clear title, secretary, deputy secretary is a clear title. But if you're a deputy national security advisor or the U.S. envoy, as you were during the Trump last administration, U.S. envoy to Iran, or for representative for Iran, U.S. representative for Venezuela, there's no short moniker. So if you all just kind of bear with me. But either way, it's wonderful to have you back. We will get to the Middle East, especially the kind of momentous occurrences of the last few days with regards to the Gaza war, and hopefully that leads to a longer-term cessation and hostilities. We'll also discuss Venezuela. We have deep experience recently in the last Trump administration. But there are very few people who have such a high level and intense level of experience at three very uniquely different Republican presidencies. For you, obviously, first under Reagan, then under Bush 43, and then under President Trump in his first term. Maybe he might invite you back again, I don't know. But there are three extremely different perspectives and views on the world, especially, I would say, going from Bush 43 to where we are with Trump now. What's your take on the assessment that has the Republican perspective on foreign policy and global leadership changed from one where it was to be engaged, to have strong alliances around the world, to have a military capability that would be kind of unmatched, to one where there are still people like Mitch McConnell or Representative McCall, strong advocates of U.S. leadership, but there are also those who would say the U.S. should step back. We should be isolationist. We should focus on what's happening at home. We shouldn't care so much about what's happening in Ukraine or Taiwan. Do you think this is a permanent, long-term shift in terms of a Republican perspective, or we just have to wait and see?
I mean, I'm tempted to say, I don't know. Next question.
Oh, wait. Let me see.
Not on?
Okay. Is that on?
There we go. Let's see.
Okay.
Now it is. First, thank you all for being here. I know this is really cold for you guys. When I left Washington yesterday morning it was 8 degrees. So my sympathy is there, but it's limited. There's clearly been a change. I think you can draw a line, Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Bush. And that's it. Did they have really terribly different foreign policies? I would say no. Trump is different. It's partly because his voters are different. He has created a more of a working class Republican Party, more of a populist Republican Party. What I think we don't really know is, what does that party look like 4 years from now after Trump? If you look at the Senate, okay, we went from Mitch McConnell to John Thune. Not a big change in terms of foreign policy. Same thing in the House. I think a lot of people thought Mike Johnson was going to be a sort of very weird, a right-wing speaker. He's not. He's a conservative speaker. So what happens after Trump? Does the party tend to move back toward the Republican norm? Not all the way back, but I think there's only one Trump. My own view is that if his son tries to succeed him and take over the movement, or if Vance does, it's not going to work because he's unique. So I would expect to see a somewhat more traditional foreign policy.
You obviously spent many hours in the Oval Office with Reagan on some incredibly difficult issues. Some, Iran Contra, you can take it any way you want from there, to Bush and some people would say maybe attempting too much in the Middle East, or maybe being too optimistic in terms of human rights promotion and democracy promotion, to being in the room with President Trump, especially with regards to Iran and Venezuela. How do you see his kind of core motivational ideology or view of the world, or is it hard to say?
Well, it is. I mean, it is hard to say. And one thing we'll find out, is this Trump different from the first term? So far, no. But, it's only 3 days, so give him time. I think if you think of Reagan or Bush, Trump really is more transactional. I mean, everybody says that. But I think it's true. That is, in each individual interaction with another government or about a discrete problem, it's kind of what's in it for me. And I think you can put this in business terms. That is, yes, you may have had a business relationship with this company or this guy, but now comes a new deal. And you're not going to say, well, we're old friends, so you can have it for $1 million less. He's not going to do that. And he's not going to do that for the Europeans either. Yes, we love them. We love NATO. We've been in this together throughout the Cold War. What have you done for me lately? And I think if you go too far with that, it's a mistake. I don't think it's a mistake to think, at least in part, that way. I mean, every president, not every Republican, every president's been saying to the Europeans for decades, you've got to spend more on your defense. You've got to help more in NATO. And then we changed the subject, and they would do nothing. So Trump, in his first term, pushed it much harder. And feeling the threat, they started spending more on defense. It worked. And the NATO Secretary General, said, why are we in better shape? We're in better shape because of Trump. So I think the question is, how far is he going to go in that direction? And I think we don't know. Clearly, to me, some of what he's doing is negotiating. And example, Canada. He's fooling around, he was, with Justin Trudeau and with calling him the governor of the 51st state. All of this is laying the groundwork for a negotiation we are going to have on tariffs with Canada and Mexico and reforms in the USMCA that Trump had negotiated. Other parts of it I don't quite understand, and the example I'd give you is Panama. I don't know what he's doing, because the things that he's saying, A, that China is running the canal, and B, that we are being treated badly with malice, it's not true. It's just not true. So I don't understand the negotiation that is going to come out of this. If he thinks that we can get preferential treatment, so every other country in the world will pay X canal fee, but we'll only pay 1/2 of X, that's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen, actually. I can't ever mention Panama without reminding you of what Ronald Reagan said in those days about the Panama Canal. We stole it fair and square.
Yes. Before we just kind of look at Russia and China, but just kind of follow up to that, how do you kind of square the circle that Trump has said in many different ways before he was elected in 2016, his first term, and again, running again, I'm not going to get involved in necessary wars. We're going to be, not, having Americans deployed unnecessarily abroad. But at the same time, implicitly or explicitly saying, I won't rule out any potential measures for Greenland or for Panama or something along those lines that really sounds in a lot of ways kind of like a neo-colonial perspective, like an idea of the U.S. retaking land abroad, which would happen militarily. But how does that square with his own kind of general approach?
I think it does in a way. He's not a guy who's ever going to say, who's ever going to limit himself. So if you say, surely you don't mean this, we'll say, well, I don't know. Well, maybe. You're not going to use force with Panama, are you? He would say, well, we'll see. He's not going to limit himself. He's not going to rule things out. But I think it works in this sense. He really doesn't want us involved in wars. This is after Afghanistan and Iraq. And he did one significant act of violence, which is he ordered the killing of Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force of Iran. He's not opposed to using force. But he doesn't want to get involved in another war where we've got 50,000 or 100,000 troops overseas for years, which has an impact on our foreign policy, has an impact on our economy, and people die. And I think you should take seriously, we all should, his comments about Ukraine, which are, I don't think I agree with his policy much, but what he's saying is there's too much dying. Too many people are being killed. Ukraine's being destroyed. It's got to end. Well, that's a good thought. I mean, that is a good way to think about it. And I think he really does mean that. That doesn't mean you can't have a tough foreign policy. And I would remind you how many wars Reagan got us into. 0. I mean, he did I don't call it a war, Grenada. Yeah. Not a very big deal. He didn't even invade Panama, which was something we thought about, but that was George H.W. Bush who did that. So I take seriously Trump's desire to keep us out of wars, and I think if people are recommending to him that we need to take military action, it'll be Soleimani-type actions. That is, it's over when you announce it, or it's over in 2 days. I think he's serious about that. The test would be Taiwan, and I hope that we never face that test.
Yeah, I mean, cataclysmic possibilities there. But you mentioned Ukraine, obviously Putin first invaded 2014, taking Crimea, fomenting a civil war in Donbass that killed 14,000, 15,000 Ukrainians well before the full-scale invasion in 2022. We've hosted a number of Ukrainians here through the council. Ukrainians who live here, a lot of them were genuinely, I would say, almost terrified of what Trump may or may not do, understanding that it is great to have the support of NATO European members in terms of military capabilities, financial capabilities, but if the U.S. really cut off financial, political, military support, they see very dark days ahead. It probably surprised people, was it on Tuesday, that Trump actually tweeted something kind of calling out Putin, some of those kind of the harshest terms he's used against him, and saying, I'll stop this ridiculous war, I'll put enormous sanctions on you. Where do you think he's going with that? Obviously, he knows he can't solve this in a day, he's going to negotiate it in a day, but what do you think he's actually trying to accomplish?
I think he really wants a negotiation. And I think a cold view of what deal is possible would leave the Russians in control of parts of eastern Ukraine that they do control. And I think Trump would say, those are the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, and obviously Crimea. He also says, by the way, this didn't happen when I was president. None of this stuff happened while I was president. I think that's a fair comment. I mean, it's a factual statement. Putin did not test him that way. I think what he thinks is there's a deal to be had here. Nobody will be happy with it, but the killing will stop. The Ukrainians certainly won't be happy, and they'll view it as a kind of ceasefire rather than a permanent change in their borders. Something will have to be done for them. For example, a path to join the EU, plus economic help. I think he means what he said to Putin. That is, I am trying to do a deal here. And if your reaction is drop dead, you will be sorry. Not because I'm invading Russia, but your economy is in bad shape. It will be in worse shape when I'm done with you. So make the deal. I have to say, what do you think of that? I have to say, I think there are a fair number of Ukrainians today, a fair number, I think it's very hard to know the exact number, who would take that deal. Because their country is being hit every day, and because people are dying. Ukrainian soldiers are dying. It's going to be a hard deal. Obviously, the Ukrainians, Zelensky, are going to ask for as much as they can get. And if Trump gets that deal, you know, Putin will have, in some ways, been rewarded for aggression. He will have territory that he didn't previously have. But Trump comes in today, not 4 years ago. What are the alternatives? One alternative is to walk away from it completely. And Trump is not doing that. Another alternative is to say, keep fighting the way we were under Biden. And Trump has already said that was, and many Republicans in the Senate have said, that was giving them enough to carry on the war, but not enough to win. So they just keep dying. There is another alternative, which is try to win. I think that's a reasonable policy. It will keep the war going for a long time. It will cost us and the Europeans a lot. I don't think, personally, the dangers of escalation by Putin are very great. But I think what Trump is saying is a reasonable policy to try to end the war.
Leaving out the dynamics for Putin, which are hard to imagine, and he enjoys being unpredictable, perhaps in some ways like Trump himself. But he obviously, in the back of his mind, Russian history of a losing leader, whether it be Russian or Soviet, good things usually don't follow. So for him, I think some people say he's willing to take this as long as possible. He's willing to sacrifice huge numbers of Russian lives. He kind of is callous about it, and even better if they're North Koreans that are going to be killed there. But from the Ukrainian perspective, from Zelensky's perspective, it's a very understandable. They would say, we trusted the West before they let us down. 1994, you weren't in the Bush 41 administration, but we had the Budapest Memorandum. We gave up the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, and the Russians, the British, and Americans guaranteed to respect our sovereignty, protect our borders, and basically give us a degree of independence and sovereignty that obviously was violated horribly by the Russians. And they would say if we kept our nuclear weapons, they probably wouldn't have invaded us. We will not sign any agreement unless we have a defensive guarantee from the United States. We don't, not NATO, doesn't mean European Union. Yeah. Even it's a bilateral agreement as we have with Japan or South Korea, that's the only way we'll sign anything. Otherwise, Putin sells hundreds of billions more of oil to India and China. He builds his army and he invades again in 7-8 years. How do you guarantee the Ukrainians a degree of security and safety, but Trump likely would not be willing to extend a new alliance for the United States?
Yeah, that's the critical problem. First, I can see why Ukrainians would say, you the West, you promised us when we gave up the nuclear weapons, and you're not coming through. On the one hand, how much have we spent on Ukraine? 100 billion, 200 billion? I mean, how much have we given them? It's not as if Russia invaded and we said, oh, hard luck. We didn't walk away. But secondly, there's an old expression that states are cold beasts, meaning, the world is a jungle. And we all have to look out for our security. And there are people out there who are enemies of the United States, Putin, Xi Jinping, the Iranians. And we've got to balance all this. And if the balance we come to is we're not going to go to war with Russia over this. We've spent 100 or 200 billion. We've helped you. We will continue to help you. I think it's hard to say that we've kind of, walked away or abandoned the Ukrainians. Now, your question's the right question. How do we prevent Putin from doing it again? I don't know what the president has in mind. He's not going to put U.S. troops into Ukraine. Would he support putting European troops there on the line? I think the answer is yes. French, German, British, so that the Russians would have to kill them to come across again. I think he would support that if they'd be willing to do it. Maybe some kind of bilateral defense agreement with Ukraine. to make sure that they have the military they need to defend against another round of Russian aggression. What I think he won't do is give them a NATO-like treaty where we are pledged to the defense of Ukraine, and he won't put American soldiers there. That's just not the way he thinks about the world.
And obviously the big question is China, President Xi, what lessons is he or are they not taking from Ukraine in relation to Taiwan? Going back 50 or so years, Republican or Democratic presidents, until recently, the general policy was kind of strategic ambiguity. We will not definitively say if we will or will not defend Taiwan. Biden, at first people thought maybe it was a mistake, but I think he said it 3 or 4 times publicly. Maybe it was a mistake, I don't know, could be. But said we would defend Taiwan, which greatly alarmed some of his military commanders, I'm sure. But where do you see that truly dire issue with Trump in terms of, in his first administration, he was suggesting to Korea and Japan that they maybe develop their own nuclear weapons, so we wouldn't necessarily have to give them our nuclear umbrella. He never dedicated himself to anything specific about Taiwan, but how do you see him kind of pushing back on Taiwan in regards to China?
Well, the beginning of the answer is, I don't think we know. I think many people around him, Mike Waltz, the new National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, are going to tell him that if he doesn't defend Taiwan, the world changes. And every guarantee we've ever given anybody is worthless. What guarantee did we give Ukraine? We didn't. They're not in NATO. We never pledged to defend Ukraine. Taiwan's different. We have told the Chinese over decades, don't do it. There were things we should be doing now, I think, and I hope Trump will do, to kind of toughen that target, which is, I think, clearly in our interest. That is, the best way to deter, I believe, is to make Xi Jinping understand what he would lose because, you'd make Taiwan, it's kind of porcupine theory. We can and should do that, and Xi has no basis to complain about that. He will complain, but that's okay. Trump wants to go there. He wants to talk to Xi Jinping. I think Xi has talked about being ready in 27 to take Taiwan. It's unless things happen between now and then, it's hard for me to see him challenging Trump that way. This is the old Nixon unpredictability thing. I think it would be a calamitous mistake for Trump to suggest that he would definitely not defend Taiwan, because that is not what you want in Xi Jinping's head. So I hope he'll help them defend themselves better. I hope he will demand that they defend themselves better. They could get better organized. They need to spend more money on their own defense. I just think it very unlikely that Xi is going to challenge Trump in that way. If he does, then I think we do have to defend Taiwan. Because if the Chinese go for Taiwan and our reaction is, well, that would be a big fight. We don't want to do that. Then what you have told Xi Jinping is, you want to muscle Vietnam because they've got a good industrial economy now. You want to muscle the Australians or the South Koreans. Maybe the North Koreans want to muscle the South Koreans. We're not going to do anything. What does it say to the Iranians? What does it say to Putin? So I think it would be a disaster. And I think everybody around Trump is going to tell him that's a disaster and you can avoid it. And the first thing to do is talk to Xi about it.
Obviously fascinating career and experience, so many different areas, there's so much to talk about. But to jump a complete another region of the world, Latin America, we had deep experience in Reagan administration, experience again in a broader sense for Bush 43. But as U.S. Special Representative for Venezuela for President Trump, You came in at almost the exact same time as interim president Juan Guaido
Yep.
kind of rose as a potential optimistic figure. His legitimacy derived from saying the last legitimate elections. This is basically this is in essence this is the Congress that was elected. They have selected me as a representative. There was a period of a few weeks of optimism, recognition from most of the democratic world, I would say, in Europe and Canada and Asia. How or why do you think things did not work out with regards to that? You can call it a coup, you can call it a people power moment. Why do you think it didn't work?
Our policy was to try to bring democracy back to Venezuela, and we failed. Why did we fail? I think the answer is because we didn't do the one thing that might have made the difference. And you're not supposed to say these things, but I'll say it anyway. We did not tell the CIA, overthrow that government. We did not do that. We had a huge diplomatic effort, and we had all the Europeans, the Latins, we had a lot of solidarity, but the military stuck with Maduro. There was no point at which President Trump said to Pompeo, was the first CIA director, I want that guy out. So you need to get the military to turn against him. I'm not talking about an American invasion of Venezuela. You need to get the military to get rid of him. And then we'll deal with the military, and they can be there for a year, and then we'll have an election and so forth. We never did that. And there was a point early on, it's clear to me, say January, February, March, April of 2019, people in Venezuela were on the fence. I mean, the power elites in the intelligence services, particularly in the Army, President of the Supreme Court, Minister of Defense, they were thinking, well, if the gringos say Maduro has to go, maybe he has to go. There was a negotiation between the opposition and the head of the Supreme Court and the Minister of Defense about them getting rid of Maduro. Then on April 30th, there was that failed uprising, and I think that was the end of it, actually, though we kept it going till the end of the Trump administration. I think that's when people with influence in Venezuela said, okay, the Americans are not going to do much. They're going to talk, they're going to do diplomacy, they're going to get, we're going to be denounced at the UN, but they're not going to do anything. And I don't know whether, frankly, the CIA today has the capacity to do that. In 1960 or 70, 1980, they had that capacity. We never found out. We never tried. And that's what I would have added. And I think had we done that, it would have been different.
Just last thing on Venezuela in terms of what was or was not possible. The Venezuelan army, despite its size, has, I think, comparable numbers of generals of the United States military, which
has the same number of generals as all the NATO countries put together.
Yes.
It's unbelievable.
But a lot of people would say, not always, but often in history, for a change in regime, a change in power, if the military, as you mentioned, doesn't get behind something, it's much less likely to happen. Unlike other countries, Colombia's shipment of cocaine had been disrupted, and a lot of it ended up, some of it from the United States efforts, Plan Colombia, like Bush 43's efforts, gets piped into and running through Venezuela. And it's the Venezuelan military that is making hundreds of millions of dollars from the drug trade. And it just comes down to, do you think the idea that in some ways, why would a general give up something for an idealistic idea of a new President Guaido when I'm getting $1 million a year just to turn a blind eye to these cartels?
When I worked for Reagan, and then the year or two after that under George H.W. Bush, most of Latin America was run by generals. There had been military coups. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and they all left. And the question that I've asked myself is, why did that happen but not Venezuela? And I think the answer is, those were generals. They thought their countries were going to be taken over by communists, so they did a coup. That was their crime, if you will. So when Reagan came along and said, that was great, but it's time to go, all they wanted was immunity for doing the coup. They were not criminals. They were generals. But Venezuela is different. The people in power in Venezuela are criminals. They are engaged in human trafficking, gold trafficking, and above all, drug trafficking, with the worst gangs, the Tren de Aragua, drug trafficking to the U.S. All those Colombian drug gangs and armies are in Venezuela. So they know something the generals didn't face. Those South American generals, they knew, we'll do this deal, you get immunity for the coup, go home. Just go home. These people in Venezuela know that if there's ever any justice, they're going to go to prison because they are really criminals. And they've murdered and tortured lots of people. How do you get them out? Well, you do need, if we can ever do this, we're going to need some kind of immunity. I mean, every country that went through this, not only in South America, but think of South Africa, every country that went through this had some kind of transitional justice, some kind of immunity. Going to have to do that in Venezuela too. It's probably another mistake we made. I said that, others said that, but we probably didn't say it loud enough. And the message that I wanted the CIA to deliver was precisely that. We'll get you a deal, but you got to go. And you got to take the deal now, or don't be Noriega. You may remember in Panama, at the very end of the Reagan administration, we offered Noriega a deal. Just go. Just go. Leave power, leave the country. For a while, he said, I want to come back. I said, fine, go to Taiwan for a year. He said no. And where did he end up? In a federal prison. And that's the message I think we should have given them, with the upside as well as the downside. Take the money and run, or take a real risk. And we didn't do that.
Obviously, your deepest and longest experience is related to the Middle East. I don't want to recount the last few decades or last years or so. October 7th, the worst loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, since World War II. Sadly, the follow-on response has led to massive numbers, tens of thousands of Palestinians being killed. Probably even Israeli IDF's own numbers, probably 2/3 of those are probably civilians, even if they're killing 17,000 Hamas fighters. Maybe 30 plus thousand are civilians. Gaza has been absolutely, destroyed and obliterated. It took a long time to get to it, but what's your assessment? It's very new. We'll head a second round here in just a few days of the tentative agreement that has been reached. And I suppose, how do you feel it was reached? More importantly, how optimistic are you for it to kind of at least continue for the next few weeks even?
My view is it's a terrible deal and absolutely necessary. It's a terrible deal because it doesn't get rid of Hamas, but there are living hostages there, and if the Israelis want to get them out, you can't wait 5 years. They're not going to last. So do the deal now. What's missing in the deal is the day after. Who's going to run Gaza? We have already seen Hamas emerging from the shadows. So who's going to govern in a kind of administrative sense, who collects garbage? And who is going to provide security? Providing security means you got to be willing to shoot. I mean, we know this from the UN force in Lebanon. Were they willing to shoot Hezbollah? No. Hezbollah fell when the Israelis came in because they were willing to shoot. So what force would this be? I was part of a group that did a report, it's a year ago now, We said it should be, you need a combination. You need some vetted Palestinian police. You need help from the Arabs. Maybe it's the Emiratis, Egyptians, Jordanians, whoever you can sign up to give you some police or soldiers. You need to create islands of security around a hospital, around a warehouse that distributes food. And we argued private security forces. When I would go, for example, go to the Middle East, say go to the West Bank as a US official, you know, they would take me there in armored Suburban with a few guards. They were not US government guys. They were retired special forces, you know, now working for one of these many companies. And there are many retired Australian soldiers, British, French, Canadian, American. You can't hire one of them and say, okay, you govern Gaza. That's not what they do. But you can say, protect this area. Here are the boundaries. Protect this border. Protect these convoys of trucks of food going in. That is the kind of stuff they do, and I think they ought to be part of the answer too. But there is no plan. There is no plan. Now, Netanyahu's most trusted aide, Ron Dermer, who was ambassador here, somebody said to him in a debate a few days ago, you don't have a plan because you're idiots. And he said, isn't it obvious to you that an Israeli plan would be dead on arrival? Every Arab government would say no before they even knew it was in it. He said, that's why we didn't advance one. It's got to be negotiated between the US, Egypt, Jordan, the Saudis and Emiratis and Qataris will presumably pay for it. Here I do criticize President Biden, the Biden administration. Nobody's going to do this if we don't lead. That doesn't mean that we put American soldiers in there. I'm against that. But to get the people around the table to say, okay, let's talk seriously. What are each of us willing to do? That did not happen. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it work in the George W. Bush administration, for example, where I saw Condi Rice, you know, remember the name, Prince Bandar, who was Saudi ambassador. I've seen her, you know, say to him, we want to have a meeting and we would like the king to come, and having Bandar say, no, I think that's a bad idea. And if you don't have anything else for me, and I saw her say, Bandar, sit down. Not Prince Bandar, by the way. Bandar, sit down. And just read him the Riot Act. This is what we want, and you're going to do it. We didn't do that in the Biden administration. Ever. And you can't do it every day. But occasionally you do have to do it. And this is the great gap in this plan. It will, in my view, last 6 weeks, and those 33 hostages will get out. On day 16, and we're halfway there, I guess, they're supposed to start negotiating phase 2, which comes in after 42 days from the first day. I think they might get there because I think Hamas doesn't want the fighting to start. The Israelis want more people out. It is, I'm a little optimistic about that. But then at the end of it, where are you? Hamas is still there. Nobody else is there because the Israelis will have, if it goes 2 periods of 6 weeks, so 3 months, the Israelis would be out. Hamas would be in. That is not a formula for stability. So I think if we're lucky, we get through this 3-month period, but then I think you'll see more violence.
Okay, and I'm going to turn to audience questions, but just to finish that up, and I understand this is a horrible question that could take 3 hours and we could bring you back in February, March, and April to continue. The status quo obviously has been disastrous and very difficult, whichever side, whether you're Israeli civilian or Palestinian civilian. The idea of a one-state solution, obviously huge problems. You bring in 5 million or so Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. along with 2 million or so Arabs already who are Israeli citizens.
Right.
You have demographic balances that don't work. Two-state solution, obviously significant problems there as well. I know it's hard to do, but do you see what is the basic framework of any kind of longer-term settlement you can see?
Well, I have an answer to this question. I do have an answer. And a lot of people, of course, immediately say, oh, that's crazy. I don't think it's crazy. Here's my answer. The idea of separating the Jews and the Arabs goes back to the Balfour Declaration in 1917 and was adopted by the British and then was adopted by the UN in 1948. Partition. The question that remained was Jewish state, Arab state back then. So the Jewish state exists and has existed now for 77 years almost. What is the Palestinian entity? Now, I agree there has to be one. There will never be a one-state solution. The Israelis are not going to accept it. What is the Palestinian entity? In my view, full, complete, independent, sovereign Palestinian state is impossible. It's too dangerous for Jordan, and it's too dangerous for Israel. And it's a failed state the day it starts. I mean, it's bankrupt. It has no economy. It has no great lake. It has no seashore. It has no nothing. So I say to myself, okay, this Palestinian entity should not be an independent sovereign state. It should be in confederation with a real country, one of its neighbors, which would basically be Jordan or Israel. Who's going to provide security, law and order, peace in that state? Palestinian security forces aren't, and there's the danger of Hamas rising again. But a state with real security forces could do it. So choosing Jordan or Israel. Why would that Palestinian entity, why would you confederate with a Jewish, Hebrew-speaking state instead of an Arabic-speaking Muslim state that's already half Palestinian? Jordan is half Palestinian in population. Now, I do not think I will ever be admitted to Jordan again after saying this. But when I talk to, I've had this conversation with Jordanians, and I have to tell you, Jordanian officials, if you say it to them in their offices in a meeting, they'll throw you out. Say it to them over a scotch at 11 p.m., you get a different answer. They do not want to look across the river and see Hamas. They're happy looking across and seeing the IDF, because that's security. Obviously, they need money, you need sweeteners, but I do not actually think there ever will be a Palestinian state. I think there will be a Palestinian entity, and I think it'll be part of a larger state, which I think will be Jordan. And I used to say it's a little bit like Austria-Hungary was. One king, the Kaiser, two parliaments, two prime ministers. Others have said to me, it's a little bit like Kurdistan. Kurdistan is part of Iraq, but it has a lot of local autonomy. So there are models for this, and I think it's, frankly, a more realistic answer than some of the things that people say are realistic.
And if you're okay, just go a few minutes over. I'll combine these kind of regionally, maybe the easiest way. Just kind of very quickly, I got to do Latin America, then Ukraine, Russia, and then kind of concluding. Something a student asked, Annabelle from Luther South Academy. Thank you. Always great to have the students here. And thank you, Archie Buxton, one of our best teachers for many, many years. Why do you believe that President Trump renamed the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America? Okay.
I think we're out of time, and we got to. I don't know. I mean, there are these name things. For example, the Persian Gulf. We all call it the Persian Gulf. The Saudis don't. They call it the Arabian Gulf. Why is it the Gulf of Mexico? I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, historically, I assume there is an answer. Why is it not the Gulf of,
Texas.
Yucatan, or the Gulf of Texas, or I don't know. I think some of these things, like his playing with Justin Trudeau. He does because it's so kind of fun.
You touched upon it before. This is something I'm not familiar with, but maybe just in a broader sense to give more of your perspective of why. Carol asks, is there any truth to the news which says Trump might be pressuring Panama in order to have them drop their claims against him for unpaid personal taxes? I'm not familiar with that.
I'm not familiar with that either. No, I think he's handling this wrong. Just be serious about this. There is a problem with the canal. Water. There's not enough water. So they've had to bring down the number of ships that can go through, which is bad, raises rates, it's bad for everyone. And what I think he could have done, should have done, is say to the Panamanians, okay, I'm going to take you to the IMF and the World Bank, and we're going to get you $1 billion, and we'll build reservoirs, and we'll build rivers and water canals, and we're going to solve this problem, but I want something in exchange for it. Maybe it's preferential treatment for American shipping. I'm not sure. But I think if he had approached the Panamanians that way, they do have this water problem, and they don't have the $1 billion. He might have gotten more for it than going at it this way. This is one I can't really explain to myself, because surely people are telling him, you know, the Chinese do run the port. Maybe that's another thing he wants. He wants them to break the contract with the Chinese company that is running the ports at the ends of the canal.
Two questions I'll put together on Venezuela. There's no names, it's fine, you don't have to put a name, but if you do, I will read it. These ones don't have names, but someone asked, what is your view on the situation now in Venezuela with regards to Chevron's licenses and different additional sanctions, maybe in particular related to the oil and gas industry, oil industry especially here in Houston, and similarly related to the Maduro regime. Someone asked, how direct, aggressive do you think President Trump will be now on Maduro and key figures like Diosdado Cabello and Tariq Saab, given Iranian and Russian influence in the region?
I think we don't know yet. We do know that he's got in Waltz and Rubio, who are both from Florida, people who are on the record being very anti-regime. There are some advisors who are saying to him, make a deal with Maduro. Why? Migration and oil. We'll get more oil, and we'll get fewer Venezuelans, and they'll take back anybody you can deport. I believe that's exactly wrong. But exactly wrong. First of all, as the president said a couple of days ago, we do not need their oil. We actually don't need anybody's oil. Well, we sure don't need Venezuelan oil. It's very high sulfur oil. It's very dirty oil, and they can't produce much of it. They're up maybe at 800,000 barrels a day. The billions of dollars you would need to get it, they were, before Chavez took over, 3 million barrels a day. They're not getting back to that. Could they get back to 2? Yeah. Billions of dollars later, who's investing? Who's going to do that? Next door in Guyana, you've got oodles of clean oil, very low sulfur content. That's where Exxon's investing. I think the president should say right now, Chevron out. Why do we let him go back? Biden let him go back as part of a deal for a free election. Well, how did that turn out? So I thought the day after Maduro stole the election, tell Chevron to get out, and the European oil companies. Okay, maybe you want to wait until, I think it was January 10th was the inauguration down there? Okay, that's the date. I'm hoping this comes from President Trump any day now. I really hope so. It's a very important signal, I think, in all of Latin America, but particularly Venezuela. This is an illegitimate regime. And just a word on the immigration part. People are not fleeing Venezuela because of our sanctions. And if we lift the sanctions, you will not see fewer Venezuelans leave. They're leaving because of Maduro. Or to put it differently, they're leaving because there is no hope for a better future with him there. We're going to see Syrian refugees go home now. Not all, but many, with Assad gone. We would see many Venezuelans who have family in Venezuela, who want to go home if Maduro were out. So I really hope the president rejects that bad advice and says we're going back to the full sanctions, Chevron, get out.
And just to kind of wrap up on Ukraine, you touched upon some of this already, but if you want to maybe add a note here or there. Frank asked, James Baker told Ukraine the U.S. would protect Ukraine if they gave up nuclear weapons. Did we renege on this? Maybe we could just touch upon that a bit. And then just kind of where we are now, Nicholas asked, if it came down to it, do you think Trump would be willing to defend, more willing to defend Ukraine or Taiwan? And then in terms of forces deployed, you touched upon already, unlikely for U.S. troops in Ukraine, but follow-ups. Someone asked, U.S. forces stationed in Poland, obviously border with Ukraine and Russia. Do you think he'd be likely to remove these troops from, say, Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I hope not. Just on the last part, it seems to me we have too many troops in Germany, and they ought to be moved east. If you think of the Baltic states, we have NATO. We have a NATO treaty. Article 5 says we all defend each other. That is not why Stalin never invaded Germany. He never invaded Germany because we had troops in the Fulda Gap. And he knew, you go in there, you kill Americans, it's World War III. I think if we had troops moved east from Germany, not to Ukraine, they are not a member of NATO, but to Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, I think it's a very good message to Putin. We keep our treaty pledges. Now, we never, people joke and say, how many times have we betrayed the Kurds? 5 times. I think there's a lot to that, but we never violated a treaty because we never had one. What treaty do we have with Ukraine? We don't. And that's probably the mistake the Ukrainians made back then. James Baker said, we'll take care of you. Well, I've had that experience. I've had the experience, for example, where President George W. Bush and the then Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, exchanged letters, pledging things to each other. And then the Congress, both houses, passed resolutions saying, we support what President Bush said. And then he was followed by Barack Obama, who said, it's a letter. So what? It's just a letter. If it's not a treaty, my advice to a foreign leader, you can't count on it being the view of the next president. Times change, people change. We don't violate our treaty pledges. But, if it's just a letter, if it's a phone call with Secretary Baker, you going to count on it for 20, 30 years? Don't.
And I know it's maybe, it was mentioned earlier, but a difficult line to parse. The Budapest Memorandum, sadly, was a memorandum, kind of a recognition of the major powers' perspectives, but they were not a treaty obligation. Is that a good way to describe it?
Right. And I think if you think of Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, why wasn't it a treaty? Because he didn't have the votes on Capitol Hill. He knew it would be defeated. And that should tell you something. It should tell the Iranians something, but foreigners should think about this. If you're doing an agreement, but it isn't a treaty because the votes aren't there, what does that tell you about how long it's going to last? And whether Americans in general support it, and whether the next president, maybe of a different party, will support it. I'm not saying that, the only form of diplomatic engagement ever should be a treaty. But if you're betting your nation's future on it, a phone call, a handshake, a letter is really not enough. It may be the best that you can get. It may be all you can get, but you got to recognize, I'll say it again, it's a jungle out there. Nations are cold beasts. We look after ourselves. We do more than that, particularly we in the United States have done more than that for over a century as we try to defend the frontiers of freedom. But when we do that, all of us are still thinking about our country and our security, and other countries have got to recognize it. They do it as well. And it is not shocking that we do it.
Obviously, you've had a fascinating career. Jahan mentioned in your early years, the Reagan administration, Assistant Secretary for Human Rights Issues. Later in Bush 43, Deputy National Security Advisor for global democratic efforts to spread democracy. You have seen it firsthand, and maybe you have regrets, and maybe you don't. I don't know. When we've maybe made short-term decisions with regards to a dictatorship, an autocrat. In Reagan, reluctantly supporting Saddam Hussein because of the balance against Iran, whereas 2 presidents later, under Bush 43, were invading to topple him. A good question here, there's no name, but a good question, a good way to end. Someone asked, what lesson from your past can be applied to the rising authoritarianism globally, and maybe even within the United States? Do you have concerns about that in the United States and beyond?
Yeah, I don't have concerns about the United States. I think that's way overdone. It's true that there are more dictatorships now than there were a few years ago. I always like to say no government is an NGO. Our government's not an NGO. NGOs have the great ability to say, we're about freedom of the press, we're against human trafficking, we're about whatever it is. And that's all we're about. And everything else, we're not interested in. We don't compromise. There is no government that can do that. I think what you have to do in these cases is, first of all, be realistic about what you can achieve. When we worked with the Saudis in the Bush administration on human rights, we thought, you could go in and say to the king, we actually believe in free elections, and you should resign. I mean, what is the point? What we did say was, you believe in God. You are a religious man. You should allow more freedom of religion in Saudi Arabia, because you have millions of people here. They're not Saudi citizens, but you let them in legally, who are Protestants or Catholics, Mormons. There were a couple of million Filipino Catholics, for example. That's a tough argument for them. Why shouldn't people be allowed to worship God? And we actually made progress. So one of the things you need to do is think pragmatically, what can be achieved here? What's the sharp edge that we can maybe sand down a bit so that people have a better shot in this country? We went, it's worth telling a very brief story. We had reports on human trafficking in the Emirates. You know why? They have camel races. In the camel race, you want the lightest possible jockey. So they imported children, boys, 10 years old, from Pakistan to be the jockeys. So we went to them and said, we don't want bad publicity here. We're not attacking you. This is bad. You should not permit this. And the reaction of the government was, you're right. It's not something we should permit. They sent all those boys home to Pakistan with money, gave their families money. If you go to a camel race today in the Emirates, you will see a machine figure with 2 machine arms going like this to sort of hit the camel's side to get the camel to go faster. We achieved that because we found something we thought, they can do this. So the first thing is, can you push in the right direction? In some cases, no. But when you can, you should. The other, I think, is when you deal with these governments, say what you think. And if you have to deal with really bad people, don't laugh about it, don't smile about it, wince about it. Jimmy Carter's first New Year's Eve as president, that is 77 to 78, he spent in Tehran, and he made a terrible speech where he said to the Shah, "We know your people love you." This is when the Shah's brutal secret police are torturing people, and of course, about a year before the Shah was gone. Don't do that. Don't say things that are not true. Don't talk about how all Chinese love Xi Jinping, or all Russians love Putin and he's a great leader. He's not. And when you have to deal with, and we do have to deal with tyrants and murderers, keep a straight face and say, I'm glad to be here today because our two countries have issues that we need to deal with. Don't talk about how you were great and we love you. I think people rely on us to be above that. Some small countries have to do that kind of thing. They have to, smile and bow. We're America. We don't have to do that. We should tell the truth, and we should stand up straight and talk straight in whatever country we're in.
And just before we conclude, I would note, related to Putin, you know him, I'm sure, as well. Ambassador Bill Taylor,
Yeah.
a great, foreign service officer for a long time. Actually, an infantry officer first, West Point, got out. U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. He was called back, for President Trump to be chargé d'affaires for Ukraine again twice. He knows the country very well. He knows Russia. He knows Putin very well. That'll be on February 13th. Again, thank you all for staying a few minutes afterwards. We could talk for hours, but will you all please join me in an incredible, enlightening discussion of Elliott Abrams. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.